everyone, and welcome to episode 284 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Although it's the cradle of our species and a land as rich in culture as it is legendarily rich in resources, retellings of African history often place their focus heavily on the transatlantic slave trade. And while this is valuable, too narrow a focus can make it easy to lose sight of how incredibly powerful, interconnected, and respected African people have been within the fabric of global history. The 14th century Empire of Mali is just one example of how Africans represented the pinnacle of wealth, education, and sophistication in the Middle Ages. This week, I spoke with Luke Pepera about medieval Africa. Luke is the writer and presenter behind the documentary Africa, Written Out of History for History Hit, and the new miniseries Empire of Gold for Dan Jones's podcast This Is History from Sony, a podcast that might just be familiar to some of you listeners. Luke's new book is Motherland, a journey through 500,000 years of African culture and identity. Our conversation on his approach to such a huge and often unsung part of history, what it would have been like to find yourself in one of the most powerful empires of the Middle Ages, and the story behind the famous Mansa Musa is coming up right after this. Well, welcome, Luke, to tell us all about medieval Africa as much as we know about it, and even more the history of Africa as you have told it in your new book. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
So you have a new book out. You decided to take on sort of the history of Africa. Why did you do that? That is a huge project. What were you thinking behind it?
I basically just want to give people a sense that there's so much to African peoples, African history, and African culture than the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. And with the best available archaeological, genetic, ethnographic evidence that we have, and linguistic as well, we know that human beings, Homo sapiens, the species that we are, originated in Africa. And in fact, that every human being now living is descended from a population that lived in Africa around 150,000 years ago. So there is at least 150,000 years of history in the colloquial sense, not written records per se, but of a past. And yet we focus on the recent past and also on the recent events that end up painting Africans as victims, as sort of rural backwards victims. And, you know, for me, I was born and grew up with Ghana, and I was exposed, and you know, I always went back there. Even if I was coming to school in the UK and university in the UK, and I was exposed to and knew about so much of the rich history that was there in Ghana, of the songs, the stories, you know, the masks, the drums, the mythology, and that's just one place, or even sometimes just one group in one place. You know, the history of one group in one place. So I said, there's a rich tapestry of stories, of traditions, of history here that we just don't explore. And I wanted to drive home that sense of a deep, large, expansive past. And in order to do that, I wanted to go as deep and as wide as possible. So that's why I decided to tackle this big topic. It's just to really say that, you know, it is a huge topic, and this is just an easy introduction. But, you know, let's get into it. You know, let's explore it more.
Yes, I completely understand where you're coming from. And that was the same impulse that brought me to the Middle Ages, where, you know, you're learning about it in school and you're talking to other people and realizing like there is so much here that needs to be talked about, that needs to be explored. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed your book. And I think that it's a great introduction to the wider study of such an amazing continent full of just so many different stories. And of course, we can't get into like the prehistory of Africa because this is the medieval podcast and we only have a certain amount of time. So let's get into the part that you have talked about sort of more extensively and widely, which we're going to tell people about near the end of the podcast. But that is talking about the Kingdom of Mali around the 14th century. So can you set this up for us? Like, we're talking 14th century, we're talking Mali. What would people find if they were outsiders coming to Mali at this time?
Well, thank you, first of all, for the really kind words about the book. And yeah, Mali is one of the most fascinating African civilizations. I mean, it starts off as really a collection of small kingdoms, or a series of small kingdoms around where the country of Mali is, about southwest of where Mali is, or in southwest Mali today. And in the early 13th century, the empire itself was founded by a young prince called Sundiata Keita, later, who belongs to an ethnic group called the Mandingo, who are indigenous to that part of West Africa. And he basically defeats a larger kingdom called Soso, which is the premier power in the region at the time. And after he defeats Soso and its king Somare Kante and conquers his territories, then he founds Mali and he establishes a constitution. That's the beginning of the empire as we know it. And we have an exact date for that as well, which is quite interesting, which is 1235, the year he establishes that constitution. But if you were going to go to Mali in the 14th century, by that time the kingdom has been expanded. It's also Muslim as well. The elite in Mali had been Muslim since about the 11th or 12th centuries AD, and that's because they were connected to other Muslim states and kingdoms across the world via the trans-Saharan trade. And, Muslim traders and Muslim merchants were the big dogs of that trade. They had access to markets and wealth and also to contacts, and their rulers were huge consumers of luxuries and exotica. So those are the merchants that you wanted to be in contact with, and for the people in Mali, the rulers and the merchants, in order to get closer and form closer diplomatic ties and economic ties with those merchants, they adopted Islam. So it's Muslim. It's also a giant kingdom as well. I mean, by the early 14th century, it has a population of about 50 million. And its capital city has called Niani, which is in southwest Mali. Niani has a population of a few 100,000 people, at least 100,000. It's absolutely gigantic. It's also quite, well stratified. You have serfs and farmers who mainly work the land, but actually the nobles also, there's nothing ignoble about working the land too, so they're involved in it, but mainly serfs who work the land. And then you also have a caste of craftspeople, weavers, potters, blacksmiths as well, who serve the elite. And then in sort of the center of the capital itself, that's where the elite's households and the palaces are. And the climate of the place, it's quite interesting because I think we, especially now with the Sahel and Sahara, we kind of think of that region as being quite sort of dry and dusty and desiccated, but actually it's quite lush. So in fact, that's where they can grow all kinds of different fruits and vegetables. They grow rice as well, and they have livestock, including goats and sheep and cattle, which graze sort of in the outskirts of the empire. So it's quite lush and it's quite cool, and it gets like a fair amount of rainfall. So that's kind of the little bit of the history of the society, what it would feel like a little bit to be there, and then also the makeup of its population and sort of how it operates. And it is quite a hierarchical society as well. So, the serfs would ordinarily, there's not the same kind of feudal relationship as you see in Western European kingdoms, to be fair, where it's land owned by a particular noble who have, their retainers who work it for them. There is tribute, but it's not based on land ownership. It's basically just based on the serfs. They keep the majority of foodstuffs for themselves, but they have to send a certain amount of tribute to members of the nobility, including the Mansa as well. So that's how the empire looks, and that's how it operates.
I mean, it would have been incredible, especially if you're traveling from a long distance to arrive in this city with all of these people, all of this wealth and sophistication. It must have just been an amazing endpoint to your journey if you're traveling along the trade route. Just be like, I've never seen anything like this before, because if you're traveling from Europe, you wouldn't have seen a city this big most of the time. This would have been just mind-blowing to see such a beautiful and rich city. I'm so glad that you painted that picture for us.
Yes, and you mention the wealth, and that's one of the things that really attracts a lot of foreign visitors and merchants to Mali. I mean, the empire does have a strong agricultural foundation. Most people derive their livelihood from working the land, but one of the big commodities and one of the big exports of Mali is gold. The Mali emperors themselves don't own necessarily huge reserves of gold, but essentially in what's now Ghana, there are different, gold fields, and there are groups or castes of gold miners and gold traders who export gold from where they are, and, from the mines that belong to them or that are local to them, they export them up to Mali. So traders will come down from Mali, and then they will exchange whatever they have for the gold. And then as it's coming into the empire, basically as those traders take it back through the empire and usually send it further afield to North Africa or to the Mediterranean, the Mali emperor basically is taxing the merchants who are bringing the gold through their empire. He'll take a little bit of the gold they bring in. So that's how he kind of amasses his wealth, because he has close relations usually with the merchants themselves, but also actually directly with the gold miners and the gold dealers. He has access to extraordinary wealth. But, copper is also a big commodity. Salt is a huge commodity as well. There's one town called Tagaza, which has these It's nearish the capital, but it has huge amounts of salt reserves as well, and that's essential for when you're crossing the Sahara too. So because of its natural resources and the emperor's access to natural resources, Mali becomes extraordinarily wealthy, and a lot of that wealth is invested in architecture as well, especially, they're building with a mud brick, sometimes in stone, but usually a mud brick. But, the center of Niani is very built up and it's very urbanized. And then also in clothing, the elite or the nobility wear silk or sometimes actually European fabrics, and then are decked out in jewelry, usually gold, silver. They have gold and silver maces, swords, scabbards, necklaces, circlets. They also wear a lot of jewelry too. And so that's all, part of the demonstration of the king as well. So I think as a traveler, this is something, and if, we have accounts of travelers where this is something that's obviously very apparent to people who are coming from different places, actually just the amount of wealth on display. And that's also just a sketch of how or where the Mali elite and the Mali emperor himself, from where he derives his wealth.
I think this is so interesting in that there is so much gold there. There's so much richness there that when the people from Mali are speaking to other traders, they'll have a sense of how much the other traders will value the gold. But I wanted to ask you, do you feel like within the empire of Mali itself, that people are like, it's just gold, whatever. It's not as big a deal for them? Or do you feel like it's still as valuable for them and they just have a higher standard of living when it comes to making themselves look good?
That's a great question. I think there's something inherently alluring about gold itself, that it's, it's sparkly, it's heavy, and it's relatively rare that, there is a sense of wanting to use it aesthetically, basically. So you want to use it in art, you want to use it in jewelry, you want to use it in fashion. But actually, for the most part, the Malians themselves view gold as a valuable commodity really only because other people find it so extremely valuable. And because it's so abundant in the kingdom, it's not seen in the kingdom itself as having as much intrinsic value because of its abundance, but it's seen as a very valuable export, essentially. And also in order to demonstrate to other people coming, whether that's rulers or traders or merchants or diplomats, that Mali is rich, they will display that gold because they know that it is something that other people look on as valuable.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that question because often you'll find when cultures mix, where the culture, maybe the home culture that is having contact from outside is like, oh, I didn't realize that people thought this was so important. So I was wondering, when you have an empire that is so rich in gold, which is thought of outside of it as being such a valuable commodity, if people were just kind of more blasé within the empire itself.
Yes, the emperors themselves are definitely also really well educated in the value of their gold. I mean, the minerals as well, but especially gold, copper, and then to a lesser extent, salt is something that use. And, it is seen as, even, in the medieval era, this kind of international currency that is valued and accepted everywhere. And the Malians, and especially the Malian elite, are really profoundly aware of that and trade off on that in order to highlight the impressiveness of themselves and of their kingdom.
Right, exactly. If you've got it, flaunt it,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Okay. So when we think about Mali, when we think about gold, we have to be thinking about Mansa Musa. And I don't think we've spent much time on this podcast talking about him. I think he's come up a few times, but we haven't spent much time. So this is the moment to talk about Mansa Musa. So tell us a little bit about who this guy is when he first comes on the scene.
So Mansa Musa is the emperor of Mali in the early 14th century. So he rules from about 1312 to 1337. And Mansa itself means emperor. So he's called Mansa Musa, which translates in the Malinke language, the language of the Mandinga people who are indigenous to Mali, as Emperor Musa. But his full name is Kanku Musa Keita. And he comes to the throne in quite an extraordinary way. And when he's young, when he's about a teenager, so we don't know exactly when he's born, but it's probably around the 1280s, or some maybe between 1280 and 1290. So when he's quite young, a teenager, or perhaps even just before 1300s, let's say 1308 or something, his father, Abu Bakr II, launches an expedition of ships to sail across the Atlantic. He wants to know what's across the Atlantic, essentially. After a few years, only one captain of one of the boats comes back, and he basically says that there was a huge whirlpool, as we tried to sail across, and everybody else drowned, and I was the only one who made it back. And Musa is actually in the audience with his father Abu Bakr when the captain tells his story, and Abu Bakr, not believing the captain, commissions then over a few years then 3,000 boats. Initially, the initial expedition was 300, a few hundred, and now he commissions 3,000 boats filled with gold and food and water and sailors to go across the Atlantic and to see if there's land beyond that huge body of water. And Abu Bakr decides that he'll lead it himself. So he makes Musa regent and sets sail, but then is never seen again. So he disappears. So Musa ends up becoming emperor at quite a young age, and he develops this aversion to the sea and to the ocean. And but he inherits his father's adventurousness. But also there's this profound desire to make your name at something, for having accomplished something. There's a desire for glory that Musa, I think, also inherits. And, his chance comes in the 1320s. By this time, he's maybe late teens, early 20s, whatever it is. And he accidentally kills his mother, probably during a ceremony. Now, the nobility of Mali, one of their prerogatives, one of the things they're allowed to do was walk around the empire and also the capital wearing bows, quivers, and arrows. And quivers especially were seen as a symbol of nobility. There's some evidence for the Malians having either during ceremonies for loosing bows and arrows, shooting arrows, from their bows, or maybe potentially having archery competitions. We know that the founder of the Mali Empire, who's incidentally Musa's great uncle, Sundiata Keita, one of the stories about how he dies is that during one of these ceremonies, he's fatally struck by an arrow that an archer or, someone engaged in the ceremony has fired. And potentially the same thing might have happened with Musa and his mother. So we know that she dies during the ceremony. It's potentially Musa himself who kills her. That's the story that comes down. It's Musa himself who kills her, but that it's a complete accident. And he asks, after having committed what he sees as this incredibly tragic sin, he asks his priests, his imams, his Muslim priests, basically, what can I do in order to atone for this crime? And the priest says that you have to go to the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, in what's now Saudi Arabia, and pray there for Allah's forgiveness. So that becomes the call for action for Musa's life, is to go to Medina and atone. Now, as a Muslim himself, he also knows that, one of the things that he has to do, one of his duties or obligations as a Muslim, is to complete the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is, it's the same country as we know today, but it's very close to Medina. So he decides that he'll go to Medina and then he will also complete the pilgrimage to Mecca, and in effect, killing two birds with one stone. And also, because he has that desire for glory, he's not going to make it an ordinary pilgrimage. He's going to make it an incredibly spectacular pilgrimage in order to demonstrate his and Mali's wealth and prestige. So he engages in this huge project. It's a nationwide project of preparing for the pilgrimage. It involves getting together 60,000 of his subjects, all of whom are decked in silk and carrying gold bars, and some of whom are carrying gold scepters, as well as 100 camels, each of which is loaded with 100 kilograms of gold dust. And this is in 1323 that he sets off from his capital, Niani, in order to make the pilgrimage to Medina and thence on to Mecca. He goes across the Sahara and he passes through Gadames, a town in Libya, and then he also passes through Cairo as well. Just before he gets to Cairo, he's camped outside initially the pyramids of Giza. And then at the time, the Mamluk Egyptians who are ruling Cairo at that time, they hear and some of them even see this massive camped outside the pyramids, this huge mass of people, and they think it's potentially an invading army. So the Mamluk Sultan Al-Nazir Muhammad sends an expeditionary force to find out what's going on. And the leader, or one of the advisors who's part of that force, can hardly believe his eyes. He basically looks on the camp and says, in all my life, I've never seen anything like this. It competes in glittering glory with the African sun itself. This is what he's recorded as having said. But, with Musa and all those Malians, 60,000 and all their gods and their huge tents camped outside, as Musa's even been passing through on his journey, every time his train or his pilgrimage stops on a Friday, he commissions a mosque to be built, or at least one to be erected, either a simple one or even just leave some people behind to build a stone mosque in commemoration of his journey. When the expeditionary force, the Mamluk expeditionary force, sees the pilgrims in Giza, the leader invites them to come to Cairo, to stay in Cairo, where he has to meet Al-Nazir Muhammad. And there's this interesting diplomatic incident in Cairo because as part of Mamluk court protocol, Musa is supposed to bow and kiss the ground before Al-Nazir Muhammad. And he doesn't want to do this because part of the reason for his pilgrimage is demonstrating his wealth and his prestige and his power. So he doesn't want to subjugate himself in this way. In fact, initially, when the commander is saying we have to go see my emperor, he's refusing him. He's basically saying, no, I came from the pilgrimage. I don't want to see anybody else. I don't want to be engaged with anything else. But the commander actually even says, this is recorded as him saying, basically, I just kept pestering him until he came. He's like, I kept on at him until he came. So Musa eventually relents and says, okay, we'll go see Al-Nazir Muhammad. But when he's in the Sultan's audience chamber, he refuses to bow before him. And Al-Nazir Muhammad is not, is a ruthless monarch. He's a tough cookie. He's not someone you want to mess around with. The Mamluk court and Mamluk politics is exceedingly brutal. And in fact, Al-Nazir's older brother, had been killed by his father's counselors. Very few Mamluk princes who survived beyond a few years when they ascended the throne. But Al-Nazir has managed to stay on the throne for 15 years. So he's an exceedingly impressive king generally, but especially amongst the Mamluks. And Musa, right in front of him, just refuses to bow down. All the Mamluks are, shouting at him to kiss the ground before Al-Nazir, and Musa saying, no, I refuse, I'm just here for pilgrimage, etc. And then his main advisor, Faseke, whispers something in his ear. Then Musa walks forward, says, I prostrate myself in honor of Allah, and goes down on the ground and, and bows. That's what his advisor told him to do. He said, if you bowed in submission to Allah instead of in submission to Al-Nazir, this is something Al-Nazir, as a pious Muslim himself, wouldn't dispute. So it gets him out of having to bow to Al-Nazir himself, but then also disgracing the Mamluk Sultan in his own court. And after that, there's, it's all celebration. There's gift giving between Al-Nazir and Musa gives to every Mamluk official tons of just raw gold. It is literally documented as unworked native gold. So he's literally just always giving them raw, just unprocessed gold ore that he's brought along with him. And, the Malians themselves, the 60,000, they come into Cairo and basically start souvenir shopping. And the Cairene merchants, who see how rich they are, increase their prices. So suddenly these Malians are buying, things for 5 times the price, and 5 times what they're actually worth. And Musa himself is also buying. At a time he can sometimes tip up to 20,000 gold pieces, but it comes back to bite the merchants, because basically the Malians spend so much that they flood the Egyptian economy with gold, which reduces its price, and it leads to just mass inflation of everything else. It causes chaos, a complete economic chaos, and the officials basically have to beg Musa for his help, and Musa decides to borrow back all the gold that he spent before he carries on to Medina and then to Mecca, where he executes his objectives as well. But, that gives a sense of the kind of person Musa is and the kind of impact, actually, that an African civilization, African societies, and an African monarch can have on other places and on the world, because, the Malian spending in Egypt doesn't just affect the gold markets of Cairo, it affects the gold market of Egypt more generally, and it affects the gold markets of Africa, Asia, and Europe to an extent. So definitely the Mediterranean and probably as far as Western Europe. And, Musa is quite extraordinary, I think, in a lot of ways in African history and history more generally. And we know a lot more about him than some other monarchs because of this extraordinary pilgrimage that he undertakes. But, then he doesn't stop when he goes back. As he'd been in Medina and Mecca, he'd recruited some of the best and brightest in the Islamic world, scholars, lawyers, astronomers, poets, etc., architects, because he wanted to develop Mali. And that was part, again, of doing his duty as the emperor, but then also part of forming his legacy. So when he goes to Mali, he passes through a town that was recently conquered by his general while he'd been away, called Timbuktu. And that's where he founds one of the first universities in the world. Timbuktu, by his death in the mid-1330s, it has 25,000 students and has a library of 1 million manuscripts and has exchange programs with universities across the Islamic world. And it's turning out world-class engineers and poets and architects and lawyers. And it's one of the reasons the name Timbuktu has passed into legend, is because of Musa's investment in that place and his investment in Mali. So that's sort of a sketch of Musa's life, and especially the main part of his life, which is his pilgrimage and also the way in which he develops Mali. But he definitely looms large in Mali and I think African history because of his wealth as a Mali emperor wasn't necessarily extraordinary, but the way in which he utilized it was something few, if any other Mali emperors copied or engaged with.
Well, I think that it illustrates so many of your points just beautifully, the story and the way that you've pulled out certain details from it. Because for Musa to bring such gifts, as you say, he was already aware of what an impact this was going to have. So like this is a very smart play on his part. He knows that this is going to really have an impact on the marketplaces of Cairo. Maybe he didn't have an idea of how deep an impact it was going to be, because this is all based on like the greed perhaps of the merchants who are inflating their prices and things like that. But he knows what an impressive figure he is, and he's coming with this self-confidence. And I think this is so important, especially to your broader narrative of like, we can't talk about people from Africa as just being victims of a slave trade, you know? When you look at Musa and his own self-confidence, he doesn't need to bow to anyone because he knows how much he's worth. And then the other thing that I think is really important that comes out of this story, like famously, I'm not very good at geography. I have like maps on the wall because I'm terrible at it. So I looked at the distance that they would have been traveling on this pilgrimage, and it is immense. So when you're talking about the wealth of Mali at this time being not just gold, but being food, like the amount of food and resources it takes to make that journey, like that really speaks to the wealth of the Empire of Mali. And then, of course, Timbuktu having this amazing university. I think this is something that is missing from a lot of history books.
Yes, yes. And actually, it's a 5,000-mile journey, and it's a long journey. It's interesting to also think quite pragmatically about how a journey like that would have been executed, because it's not just the carrying of the gold itself or being decked out in silk. You also have, food and water to feed the camels and to feed the people as well. And also you need guards to it's well known that the journey is hazardous, not just because of the dangers of the desert, but, there are bandits, indigenous Saharan, or in other words, Amazigh bandits who look for caravans in order to rob. But it takes Musa 8 months to get from, Niani to Cairo, just Cairo itself, and probably about a year to actually make it to Medina and then on to Mecca. And it's a 5,000 mile journey. So the amount of planning, coordination as well that goes into it is also a testament to Musa's wealth. He is a very confident figure, and I think there are so many leaders and rulers of African nations and civilizations who have that feeling, and I think that's the important thing as well about not concentrating so much on the last 300 years, because immediately when you look just a little bit further back, and even sometimes during the later periods themselves, and when you consider African agency, which I think is really the big thing in my book, because the book Motherland, I don't just look at ancient and medieval Africa, although those feature quite heavily, and I'm generally quite interested in those. But even when I'm talking about some of the later periods and some of that history encompassing the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, my focus really is on African agency as well. What were African people thinking, feeling, and doing? And actually, there was activity on their part in shaping global affairs, like there was in the past too. And I should also say, for anyone who's interested, it's like, you did your wonderful spin-off series for Dan Jones's This Is History, the Iron King. And I'm doing one on Mansa Musa, actually, himself, on his pilgrimage and on his life, called This Is History, Empire of God. So if people are interested in learning a little bit more about the detail of Musa's pilgrimage and, about his life and how he goes about things, and also some twists in the tale that I neglected to mention in my little sketch, then that would definitely be to check it out, and for them to check out your awesome spin-off too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Well, this is the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast now, is because I want people to learn more about your work, but also about Mansa Musa. And this is the perfect opportunity to do that. You brought this all together on This Is History, which, yeah, it was such a fun project for me to do. And it sounds like it was fun for you to do. I'm very glad that we both had the experience to talk about individuals who shaped history.
Yes, and to also just consider them almost as living, breathing people as well, when you're wringing out the drama of their lives, not as dusty historical figures, but people who actually, they actually lived, living and breathing, and they had impact on the world around them, and actually on our world too.
Yes, and the decisions that they make, they're based on those small moments or those big moments, like accidentally killing your mother. That is going to set you on a new trajectory. But those moments, I think, are so important, which brings me to one of the questions I wanted to ask you about your work specifically. And that one of the things that you mentioned in your book, Motherland, is that it can be challenging to talk about African history broadly, and then even in specifics, because for a lot of people who are living in Africa now, a lot of people who are from Africa somewhere in the past, thinking about the past is not something that is over. It is something that is continuous, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how this works into your thinking when you're looking at the historical past? As somebody who is immersed in cultures, don't necessarily think of it as like a temporal past, but as a continual present.
Yes, I think Africans generally more consider the past as being more fluid. There's not as clear a distinction as there is in, for example, although, not exclusively, but for example, European cultures, there's clear distinction between past, present, and even future. Everything kind of flows into one or the other. So some practices and sometimes even artifacts, just because they're made in a certain time in a different time, doesn't mean they belong to that time. They still belong to the people who are of today. I mean, there are festivals, for example, in Ghana, where I'm from, where people will be firing guns that are 200 years old, as they have done for the past 200 years, almost as if they were created yesterday or bought yesterday. They aren't kept, for instance, behind glass in a museum and considered an artifact of a particular time, representing a particular time and distinct from our time, but actually they'll be looked after and considered and kept as, as an object that still has relevance, because it does still have relevance. So that was something that I think, being African, I kind of felt, I considered, you will see it a little bit. I saw it a little bit when I was doing my research and, when I was looking a little bit more on the academic literature. But also if you're looking at history written by historians who've studied traditional history, they will still create that distinction just in order to make it more intelligible. But at least if you're looking more at anthropology, or at least for me, as I was writing it, I said, it doesn't really feel right to create those clear distinctions. I know that there are some rituals, there are some practices, there are some artifacts that don't belong to the past, but they belong very much to the present, and they are considered present day objects, not historical objects. But it's almost like present day objects that were used by your ancestors, whether that ancestor was, someone who lived 500 years ago, or it was your grandfather or father. You think of it still as having that present day resonance and that present day importance. So I think that's something that does distinguish, or something that's a little bit distinct in African cultures. And it's something that I felt that I had to explore, or at least interrogate in a discussion, which, the book is, in a discussion of the African past. I hope I've explained it sort of in a way that kind of makes sense, is a little bit intelligible.
Yes. Well, it's something that is also found in lots of indigenous cultures across the world. I was speaking with James Flexner, who works on Oceania, and he was talking about these oral tales, which we can't really talk about as being in the past. And here in North America, there's lots of indigenous cultures where it's weird to talk about the past as being something that is over. And so, as somebody who's working on writing history within a context of perhaps the English-speaking tradition of maybe European publishing, thinking about how to get this across. This is something that I'm sure that you had to wrestle with quite a lot. Like, how do I express this in a way that translates, as you're saying, that resonates today? And so when I'm thinking about the sources that you were using for this book, how did you approach this? So again, we're talking about there's oral traditions, there's objects. How did you approach this when you're coming at this book in particular?
I relied a lot on not just written documentation, but actually as well on some oral history, stories, mythology, and also on archaeology and anthropology in order to build up a full picture of an event, a person, and most especially a place or a society or a civilization. For the places where some of the wild religions penetrated, for instance, Ethiopia, which I don't talk about a lot in the book, but definitely, for example, the Swahili coast and also Mali, that's when you have a more written documentation, because Muslim traders and travelers were extremely mobile, went to different places and recorded what they saw. One of the great resources for actually both of those, at least as far as the 14th century in particular and the medieval world more generally is concerned, is the traveler Ibn Battuta, the North African traveler Ibn Battuta, who visits Mali actually during the reign of Musa's younger brother Suleiman. He also goes to the Swahili coast and he records what he sees there. And then later on as well, you have some European accounts like Portuguese accounts, but you also have even slightly earlier than Battuta in the 9th and 10th century. For instance, as far as the Swahili coast is concerned, you have Chinese accounts, for example, of Chinese traders and travelers who actually did travel to the Swahili coast itself. I think one of the things I would say that probably differentiates the book as a history book, as a popular history book, and differentiates me as a historian, a writer, or a popular historian, a writer, is that I gave as much weight
to archaeological and oral evidence as I did to written documentation. For me, they're all just part of the same picture. One isn't more credible or less credible than the other. It all comes down in the interpretation. When you're looking at oral history, you have to read between the lines a little bit more, but actually they are much more useful at giving you a psychology of the people and actually just helping you to understand the values of those people, what they are now, what they were before, and actually how those have changed. For example, archaeology can be a lot more empirical. And in fact, sometimes it can help to either support or even just give you a truth that written documentation, wouldn't necessarily give you. But more often than not is supplementary. So for example, I mentioned the Chinese merchants or traders, but they maybe wouldn't always necessarily write about what it was they were trading. But then you would find Chinese stoneware or Ming Dynasty porcelain, for example, across East Africa. So then that also helps you build up a picture. You said, okay, not only was there direct contact, but these were the kinds of things that were being brought. So I think it's important to consider all this holistically. And I think you're seeing it more in historical practice, especially when people are exploring older eras. Historians will look at a lot more at archaeology. I also use things like linguistics and genetics when looking at prehistory and, human origins as well. And that's all just to build up a picture of what I call the past. And that's why sometimes in the book, I will not just talk about African history. I'll talk about the African past because it's just everything that, has gone before and what we use in order to build up that picture. Whereas when we think of history, we think of it more. There are certain connotations, I think, that come along with it, usually derived from written documentation and usually formed or shaped into some kind of narrative rather than painting a picture. For me, it was a little bit more like doing a painting than writing like a novel, for example, in the way that I built up the past.
Well, I think this is an important discussion that we need to keep having as historians. Like, how do we build this picture of what things were like in the past? Because there are all sorts of oral traditions. There's archaeology, there's anthropology, and all of these things need to come together if we're going to have a complete picture. And so I always like to ask people whenever possible, how are you putting together this picture? What are you involving and how are you weighing the evidence? Because I do feel like there is a change in how we're doing this as historians, where we're not centering the text as much when it's not as relevant. And so I found this was a strength of your book in the way that you were discussing, like being very transparent about like, here's how I'm looking at this and here's the evidence and here's what I see within it. So one of the things that you talk about within the book is that part of your interest in studying the history broadly of Africa, but especially of Ghana, where you're from, is that you didn't find very much of it at the beginning of your journey. So how is it looking today? Can you tell us a little bit about what this field looks like, maybe African studies more broadly, or what you've seen in the history of Ghana as you're looking at it from this point in your career?
It's definitely a lot more expansive. It's definitely a lot more involved. There's been more funding and there's been more genuine interest in trying to understand, I think, across Africa, and I know in Ghana, understanding our own history, cultures, and traditions, and also respecting those rather than necessarily framing everything with Europe in the background, essentially. Mm-hmm. I tell the story at the beginning of my book of going to the National Museum of Ghana, which is just, and mainly seeing their colonial era artifacts. And that's kind of what started me on this journey to want to explore, but more importantly, share stories from the deeper African past. And, I think one of the big things has been wanting to engage young people, especially learning about their own history and engage with it. So, for example, I think that's African continental archaeology programs, histories are important. But, the departments, I think the professors, etc., have been really engaged in bringing up the next generation and also in sharing those stories, more widely. One of the reasons I came to the space when I did was that there was just a greater appetite for wanting to know, generally and cross-culture, but in Africa and amongst Africans in other places, to learn about our own history and to write it in a way that was a little bit more natural to us. But I think the field itself, Africa, has made, great strides. And I think more important, there's much more cognizance of wanting, and I think people are generally more engaged, which allows Africans themselves to meet that demand of wanting to tell stories of the deeper African past and not just of the last 300 years. But there has been a transformation, and I think as economic and political confidence in certain parts of Africa hopefully increases and improves, that will also lead to greater interest in wanting to understand history and also in creating art which reflects that history.
I'm very glad to hear you say this. I'm starting to notice that as well in the field of medieval studies, we're starting to notice more stories that are based on the African medieval past and centered around Ethiopia, especially with Verena Krebs' work. And that's starting to spread. And I'm hoping that people will read your book and listen to your podcast series on This is History and become interested in more places within this massive and rich continent. So thank you so much, Luke, for coming on and telling us all about Motherland and especially Mansa Musa.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun. Thank you, Danièle.
To find out more about Luke's work, you can follow him on Instagram at Luke Pepera. That's Luke, Pepera. You can also catch him in his mini-series Empire of Gold, which you can find directly in the podcast stream for Dan Jones's This is History. His new book is Motherland, a journey through 500,000 years of African culture and identity. This is usually the part where Peter Konieczny, the editor of medievalist.net, comes on to tell us what's new on his website. But Peter is under the weather this week, so instead, let's send him our good wishes and check out his new article on 10 famous forgeries from the Middle Ages. Thank you to all of you who support my work by letting the ads play through, sharing your favorite episodes on social media, reading, borrowing, and lending my books, and becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patrons can access all sorts of goodies like medievalist.net's book club, extensive lists of open access articles, and access to this podcast ad-free. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Mali to Bali, follow medievalist.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN-Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening and have yourself an awesome day.